Shaw Brothers is the greatest filmmaking machine in the history of the industry. And it would be very easy to somehow limit that by saying, oh, you mean in Hong Kong, or Kung Fu, or for Chinese films. No. The Hollywood moguls of the 30s, 40s, 50s, they would have begged, they would have prayed to have the degree of influence and control and power that Sir Ronan Shaw had over the Shaw Brothers studio at its height. I mean, he had his kingdom, his magic kingdom on Clearwater Bay, where he had the actors living in dormitories, all under very stiff contracts to work only for him and only for the money he wanted to pay them. Same thing with the directors, same thing with the DPs. He owned the equipment, he owned the studio space, the post-production, he printed his own posters, and he owned many of the theatres across the Asian region where the films were going to play. So it was this ultimate filmmaking entity, and it had a house style. And Shaw himself, unlike some of the other film moguls we've had in the region, was cinema was his religion, really. He was a deeply committed cineast. And so he set a certain bar of production value, script writing, performance, cinematography, editing, music to every Shaw film. And at the end of each movie it says like another great Shaw production, or words to that effect. And he made that the case. And if they messed it up, the director messed it up, he made them go back and do it again. If the actor wasn't up to snuff, he'd hire somebody else and redo their scenes in the film. And Shaw Brothers was, in the industry, in the history of the industry, matters because there has never been a studio run quite like Shaw Brothers prior to that, and the way that the industry has moved on, it can never happen again. So if you're just a student or somebody fascinated with cinema history, Shaw Brothers stands alone as the ultimate filmmaking factory in the history of the industry.
东瀛高手突袭中原，
他再严密的防守也阻止不了忍者。
江湖浩劫，血债累累。
Shaw Brothers is the starting point. It's from where the water flows for any martial arts movie fan. I mean, there were martial arts films made before Shaw Brothers. There was the black and white Wong Fei-hung films. There were the fantastique films like Buddha's Palm and these kind of films. But the first person to really come in and say, look, we're making movies in the late 60s and the 70s, and they're doing Easy Rider and 2001 A Space Odyssey and Spartacus. We've got to be at that level. We've got to aspire to tell our traditional Chinese stories, our folklore, with our martial arts and all of our kind of filmmaking, all of our storytelling savvy. We've got to make movies that compare with what they're doing in Hollywood. And that's what Ronan Shaw did. And the idea that a Chinese company could make a movie that could be released theatrically in America, as Five Fingers of Death, King Boxer was released, that you could have films that creatively, artistically stood the test of time, is entirely down to his vision and his persistence. Because prior to that, the films have been very slapdash. I mean, you see movies from the 60s, the early 60s, shot in Hong Kong. They look like they were made like 10, 20 years earlier. But when you see the Shaw Brothers era come in, he even borrowed the Warner Brothers logo at the beginning of the film. And you take it, you see the way that there's a kind of a Hollywood glamour and glitz and a style that he defined. And because you had Westerns in America, you were going to have Easterns in Hong Kong. And because you had people doing fist fights and riding horses and six guns and bow and arrow in the West, in Hong Kong you were going to have sword play, which evolved into various weapons, then into fist and foot fighting, kung fu fighting, and then into Shaolin, using the tiger and the snake and all those other styles. That evolution, just as you had perhaps in America with science fiction and the way that special effects, or in horror, prosthetic and blood effects evolved, the same thing happened in Hong Kong, but it was with their own indigenous art form, film art form, which was kung fu movies. there's a misapprehension, understandably, that everybody thinks that all the action movies that come out from Hong Kong are kung fu movies. And if you could do an all-encompassing genre specification and say, if the people in these films are using weapons or empty-handed techniques, and they've trained, and there's certain tropes of the genre, that this is a kung fu movie, or at least a martial arts film. But actually within kung fu cinema, there's different delineations. And I think that One-Armed Swordsman, Bey Logan, was a movie where it was a transformative film in so many ways. And it's interesting because I think a lot of the times now, the perception in the West is you had Hong Kong cinema before Bruce Lee and after Bruce Lee. Bruce Lee was like a phenomenon sui generis. He was not somebody who could be copied, and he was not somebody who really transformed the industry. He came into it for a very brief amount of time, had an amazing impact as Bruce Lee, and then left stage right. But prior to that, the transformative films were, one of them was One-Armed Swordsman, where prior to that you had the black and white Cantonese movies still prevalent in theatres in Hong Kong. And then you had a few films with Wong Yu working with the director Chang Chi at Shaw Brothers. Then they did One-Armed Swordsman, and that swept away Cantonese cinema. It was shot without sound, and then they dubbed it into Mandarin, and it established Mandarin as the language of classy martial arts cinema. And then you had the blood, you had a level of enhanced realism which had not been there in the fantastique swordplay black and white films you'd seen in Hong Kong prior to that. And you had the revelation of this lone hero in Wong Yu. Whereas before it had been kind of teams of people from Kunlun and Shaolin running around the Hong Kong countryside doing so. And even with Wong Fei Hung, even though it's a sole hero, he always had his students who occupied the story of most of the middle part of the film, and he'd be at the beginning and the end. But if you look at One-Armed Swordsman, it's one guy. And this was Wong Yu, I think, arguably was one of the earlier guys that came in to be a sole hero, carrying a movie from start to finish. Also, there'd been a kind of a prevalence to have female leading actors in Chinese films. And he was very male. Wong Yu was a very male leading player. And the film itself, it's choreographed by the team of Lau Garleng and Tong Gai, Liu Chaoliang and Tang Chia. And they did such a fantastic job adapting real Chinese martial arts for filmmaking that it's a watershed film. And you cannot probably underestimate the impact it had on the industry when it came out in 1967, I think. And it was it's to this day a classic. But what's interesting is that at the time when Bruce Lee was at Golden Harvest making quite cheap-looking films in which he was amazing, if you look at Return of the One-Armed Swordsman with David Chang replacing Wong Yu as the lead, because Wong Yu had left Shaw Brothers by that time, it's such an extraordinarily well-realized movie in every way. The shooting, the storytelling, the editing, the music, everything. But it's not Bruce Lee. And so it's not as well remembered. But if you look at cinematic technique, Shaw's was way ahead of anybody else at that time in the region. And it doesn't speak too well to him, but Bruce Lee had definitely entertained doing Shaw Brothers films. And I think would have worked for the rival to the company he made films for was Golden Harvest, which was made up almost entirely of key personnel, primarily Raymond Chow, the head of the company, who had broken away from Shaw Brothers to form a rival company. And they were the people that gave Bruce Lee his chance. Shaw Brothers originally had asked Bruce to come and work for them, but the offer was too low. Raymond Chow rolled the dice, and Bruce Lee made films for them. But despite that, Bruce was aware of the fact that within Golden Harvest, with the budgets, the facilities they had, he could not, he wanted to work with like Choi Yun, who was a great director of films at Shaw Brothers, who was a lifelong friend, and so he knew Choi Yun a long time. Choi Yun was under contract at Shaw Brothers, so Bruce would have to go and do a film for Shaw Brothers. Had he lived, I think he would have done a Shaw Brothers movie.
新仇旧恨，不共戴天。武盾忍术。
A lot of the text written in the West about Hong Kong films give the impression that as soon as Bruce Lee came and worked for Golden Harvest, that was the death knell for Shaw Brothers Studio. That wasn't the case. What Bruce Lee did was save what was a faltering startup, which was Golden Harvest, and allowed them to show that Shaw Brothers was not the only game in town, that indie companies could thrive in the Southeast Asian market. So you had Golden Harvest, later you had Golden Princess, D&B, you had seasonal films, and that alone was a major it kind of paved the way for the eventual demise of Shaw Brothers, because the fact is that there was a finite market which they had dominated for so long, they monopolized for so long, and then other players came in, younger, brighter, fresher filmmakers, and slowly over time the Shaw movies tended to get more stale and formulaic, and you had things like the kung fu comedies, you had the John Woo gangster movies, and the interesting thing is many of the people working at the other studios had cut their teeth at Shaw Brothers, but they didn't have the freedoms creatively and perhaps commercially that they had with the indies. So they left Shaw Brothers, and that led to the slow decline. But it's a much slower decline than people give it credit for. I mean, basically, all of the Lao Ga-Leng, Liu Cha-Liang movies from 36 Chamber on are post Bruce Lee. And they're some of the greatest kung fu movies ever made. So there's a whole run of great entertainment. The late era Chang Che movies, Choi Yun's films, all those Gulong adaptations. You have like all the Lao Ga-Leng movies, and I think with the exception maybe of like Cat vs. Rat, every one of those is a martial arts masterpiece that stands up well to this day. So you had all those films post Bruce Lee, and I think what happened was that they just, when you had a choice, you working within the very strict confines of the Shaw Brothers system, or the freedoms of having a stake in your own films and your own company, people chose the latter route, perhaps understandably. The other thing that happened with Bruce Lee came in and proved something that hadn't been the case previously, which was that one star could become so transcendent that he could name his own price and be outside of the system, because that never happened at Shaw Brothers. You know, like Lawley did Five Fingers of Death, King Boxer, and then went back to doing movies for the same cheap rate that he had before, even though that movie was the big blockbuster in America. He didn't benefit from it. Bruce Lee, by comparison, came in, got the best rate he could on the first two films, and Where the Dragon, he says to Raymond Chow, okay, I'm forming Concord Pictures, we're partners, we'll do films together. And he would have done that going forward, partnered with Warner Brothers, partnered with other companies, had Bruce Lee lived, to do other movies as an independent filmmaking entity, revolving solely around his talent and creativity. So as soon as you see that, you've got a different, kind of ambition, rather than just to make the money you can from Shaw Brothers and then retire. So you have somebody like Jackie Chan, who comes in and does 9 films that don't work, and bam, suddenly he does his kung fu comedy Snake in the Eagle Shadow, and he's the new guy, and Shaw's still stuck in the same way of thinking. They'd had the chance to sign Bruce Lee, messed it up. They had the chance to sign Jackie Chan, messed it up. They'd had Chow Yun-Fat at TVB and never made films with him, and let John Woo, who had been an assistant director at Shaw Brothers, make the breakthrough film of Chow Yun-Fat for Cinema City. Chow Yun-Fat had huge success, particularly with So Hai-Tan, the Bund, at TVB. All his initial films failed, and finally John Woo said, we're going to do A Better Tomorrow, and all the distributors begged him to use anybody but Chow Yun-Fat, and John Woo said, no, I'm insisting on it. And he had Dick Long, who'd been a big star at Shaw Brothers, Leslie Jones, who was a young pop idol, and the people said, okay, fine, we'll let you. And John Woo had success as a comedy director, but he was bankable. So they said, fine, we'll let you have Chow Yun-Fat. Now, of course, you can't think of anybody else. But hey, assistant director from Shaw's, Dick Long, the big star at Shaw's, Chow Yun-Fat from TVB. Why wasn't Shaw Brothers making that movie? So this was the trend that happened, and I think a lot of the studios, the long term, what happened to Shaw's happened to Warner Brothers in America, happened to Hammer Films in England, which is that you had a younger, hipper indie crowd coming in, and the model changed because directors' ambition was no longer to please Harry Warner, but to you make Easy Rider. You were going to do a film that played to the new zeitgeist, and that's definitely what happened with Shaw's. I, for a long time, was a Golden Harvest guy because I like Bruce Lee and I admired the films of Jackie Chan and Sammo Hung. But that one reason for that was many of the Shaw films were not then available to me. But now they've been made available worldwide. And even I came into it a little late in the day because there's 700 of them to see, by the way. And I haven't seen all of them now, probably. But I saw enough to know, my God, there's these gems that you find among them of a movie that you never heard of, like Bells of Death, or The Swift Swordsman, and you just go, what? Where did this come from? This is just so well made, so entertaining. And there's this great volume, and I think it's the greatest treasure in the history of the Southeast Asian film industry. So it's wonderful for me as a devotee of these films to see the films coming and being presented to a broader audience and given context, why they're important, why they matter to people, why the style and the themes of them are timeless, and they're still relevant today, and they're still incredibly entertaining today. It's funny because people always in the past used to say, it's so fake with all this jumping around and they fight for 15 minutes. But now, compared to what they do in American movies, the Shaw Brothers films seem quite realistic. Because they're human beings fighting in 15 minutes, and sometimes they fly around on wires, but you can kind of almost see the wires that pull them around. There's a reality, humans did that. It wasn't generated in a computer. And a lot of Hollywood movies now seem to be generated by machines. If you talk about Italian cinema, everybody talks about spaghetti westerns. But of course, when you spend some time looking at the different movies, they had spaghetti cop movies, they had spaghetti sci-fi movies, they had spaghetti Mad Max post-apocalyptic movies. You had spaghetti anything. What it meant was that an Italian filmmaker would take an existing American genre and make it their Italian style. And they're entertaining in their own rights. You would never look at one of them and go, hey, that's just like an American movie. But it had values, similar. It had an entertainment value in and of itself. And the same thing happened at Shaw Brothers in Hong Kong, which was, yes, you had a specific indigenous genre, which was the martial arts movie. But then, because Hong Kong was a colony where they had a relatively liberal regime, theatres could play all kinds of movies. You had Japanese films playing, you had American films playing, and you had films of all kinds of genres. So you had swordplay films from Japan, you had horror movies playing, sci-fi films, you had Ultraman, which they remade as Inframan, you had King Kong, which became in Mighty Peking Man. So you had the Shaw Brothers version, the soy sauce version, if you will, of every genre. And so you had horror movies like Seeding of a Ghost and Hex, and you can't imagine anybody else making those particular horror movies anywhere but Hong Kong. But the fact is that the impetus to do it was they would go, hey, The Exorcist is making all this money, we'll do The Exorcist, we'll call it Hex. But they didn't make Exorcist, they made some weird version of it, which in some ways is as entertaining as The Exorcist was. I do remember talking to Quentin Tarantino about Mighty Peking Man, because he'd released it in America on his Rolling Thunder label and saying, the great things about these movies, Quentin, is they're just so bad they become good. And he goes, no, I don't believe that. I totally reject your hypothesis of like, it's so bad it's good. No, it's good. It's a good movie. Like when he dies, you feel something. What he's saying is, you're selling yourself short if you go into the experience going, I'm going to laugh at the film, rather than buying into the fact that the filmmakers actually had quite sincere and genuine intention. They made the film they wanted to make, and it works on its own terms. And it was a good lesson. I went back and looked at these films again, and he's right. Of course, if you've got like a bunch of buddies around for beer and pizzas, you can have a good kind of fun, kind of camp, kind of film festival of some of the classic films like, Killer Snakes, Oily Maniac. There's some weird and wild, all with Danny Lee, poor old Danny Lee. Like, imagine the script conference, Oily Maniac, get Danny Lee. We'll do a Bruce Lee biopic, get Danny Lee. We need to do an Inframan, get Danny Lee. Poor Danny, he must have dreaded the phone ringing, because every weirdo movie that came along, Danny Lee was going to be in that film. There's a lot more in the Shaw Library than just the pure martial art movies, which are my favorite films. And what happened was, when Celestial began releasing them, they did them in a batch of maybe 5 a month. But 3 of them would be kung fu, and the others would be other genres. But if you're like me, you'd be like, wow, what's this? That's adultery. What's that about? And you would find among those pictures films that you otherwise would have ignored and would never have been seen, because the only films people pirated in the downtime between the theatrical and Celestial releasing the DVDs was the kung fu movies. So these movies are like gone for all time, and you go back and say, wow, that's so well made and acted, and it has a unique mad charm to it in some cases. But there are films of virtually every genre in the Shaw's Library, and I certainly recommend any true cineast to trawl through. And the great thing now, of course, with the internet is you're not flying blind. You can at least get an indication, like, if you like this, you're going to like that, and then you can take a seat.
涼風有信，秋雨無邊，虧我思嬌情緒。